Welcome. I hope it wasn't just the box lunches that drew you, but actually the content of this discussion that we're getting ready to have. I feel very honored and blessed to have who I consider, and I think I can make a strong argument for this, the most, when it comes to elected politicians at an executive level, executive type position, elected politicians, there's been no more transformational one in the last 50 years in America than D.A. Krasner. We'll get into the details of how, as a good lawyer, I have to now support that, right? I have to marshal the facts. I think we'll be able to marshal some facts that do support that conclusion abundantly. But before we launch in, I have to give thanks to those without whom this wouldn't be possible, right? The folks behind the curtain. A lot of times, of course, Dean Guzman, who's our dean, who's the Franklin Chair in Law and Professor of Law and Political Science from the Events Department. Sabrina Montez, Assistant Director of Events from the Development and Alumni Relations Department. Jill Barone and Nicole Stark from Communication. Jillian Silsby and Ann Bergman, and of course, my own Maria Chan, my own assistant. I don't know if I could find my way to law school without her. What's the difference between, I'm a creature of habit, so I'm going to start by doing a little schematic. As y'all who've had me in class know, I want to do. So I like to think of USC as not just a school of law, but a school of justice. We're striving for justice. And then we have to start thinking about, well, what are the different conceptions of justice we could be striving for? And I think of my dad's prosecutor, his conception of justice, our current prosecutor, Jackie Lacey, her conception of justice, and D.A. Krasner, his conception of justice. And these conceptions of justice I see as very different, and that's what we're going to talk about, and that's what he represents, a radical change in my dad's conception. The DA in my dad's case, he was sentenced in 2255 for possession and sale of marijuana. That's how they took out, black men back in those days, 50s, 60s. Taught himself the law. Wrote his own writ of habeas corpus, represented himself pro se up through the state system. We lost him when I was 8. We talk about family separation. Family separation has been going on in the prison system forever. You want to talk about family? So I was ripped from him at 8. And the next time I saw him standing in a courtroom, I'm 14. He's in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeal, arguing for his life before an en banc panel of judges. He prevailed. I teach his case now in my criminal law court, Armour versus Salisbury. Of course, Armour versus Salisbury, right? Which stands for the proposition that a DA cannot lie to the jury to get a conviction against the defendant. You would have thought that would have been established much earlier. You know, right, in 74. Now you shepherdize his case, it stands for that proposition. You can't outright lie to the jury and tell them you have not cut a deal with the only witness against the defendant when you have. Right? So that was a certain conception of justice informing that DA's work. And then we come to D.A. Krasner, who has a conception of justice that guides him as a progressive prosecutor. And I'm hoping we'll get to that in your role as a progressive prosecutor, and you're being guided and informed by a certain conception of justice. I'm wondering what that conception is. And I think one of the jumping off points for me of what it is your platform. That you said you could write on a napkin, which was very straightforward, right? Eliminate cash bail. It shouldn't be about poverty, crimes of poverty. Address police misconduct and end mass incarceration. Now, that's a new, a prosecutor who's driven by that conception of justice is a different one than my dad's or the one that we have now sitting in LA. Right? That's a very different conception of justice. So, and you were able to take that platform and that conception of justice and get 75% of the electorate to vote for you, to support that sea change in conceptions of justice. Right? All jaw-dropping. You know, I'm just in awe of that achievement. I would not have thought it was possible, really, 5 or 10 years ago. I couldn't have conceived it. And you yourself, I mean, in the article they talked about your own firm erupted in laughter when you first announced that you were getting ready to run for the DA's position. So can you talk a little about that, you know, kind of what motivated you, what reactions you got? I think the police, the head of the police union proclaimed your candidacy hilarious.
Yes, he did, which it was. So I'd love to answer that. Let me, however, make sure I identify for you that present here with me today is the Honorable Carolyn Engel Teman, seated in this fetching blue outfit. Judge Teman is one of our 2 first assistants. The other one is a man named Robert Listenby, who's not here today because he's taking care of business back in Philly. But Mr. Listenby was the chief of juvenile justice for Barack Obama for 4 years. And he has been a blessing, and the judge has also been a blessing. She has a fascinating history that includes having been the first woman to be a public defender in Philadelphia County, having been an assistant district attorney, a homicide prosecutor, and an appeals prosecutor for then Philadelphia District Attorney Arlen Specter, who later went on to be a United States Senator and went on to control access to our Supreme Court, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And she was a judge in the highest trial court in Philadelphia County for 29 years before, among other things, going on to do international human rights judging work. So that is, you know, that is the kind of person we have in this office. That's the caliber of person that we are seeking to bring into this office. And yes, I am here to recruit, just so we're all clear. We will be doing interviews after this event today. And anyone who didn't sign up, please come to the front and talk to us, because we're not playing when it comes to that. One final thing about the judge, she has a nickname, which most people are afraid to tell her in the office. Her initials are C-E-T, and the nickname is the, who knows, the notorious C-E-T. That is her nickname, for good reason. She's better on criminal justice than RBG, who's also a shero of mine. But anyway, so to come back to your question, hilarity in the office. Yeah, there was some hilarity in the office. I had been a criminal defense attorney in court 4 to 5 days a week for 30 years. I had been a civil rights attorney after having been a state and federal public defender for 25 years on top of my, my day job, which was to be a criminal defense attorney, and had tried thousands of cases. I was not the most obvious person, having sued the Philadelphia Police Department over 75 times for corruption, for excessive force, sometimes killings, for framing people. I was not the most obvious choice to people who think of a prosecutor in the way that Professor Armour has laid out on his board, my dad's DA. My dad's DA, I think most of us understand to be a retributive politician who relies upon fear primarily to advance their own career, because being a district attorney has been a launch pad to be the governor or to be in the United States Senate for about 50 to 100 years, a period of time that in many people's minds coincides with the rise of mass incarceration. Essentially a process not so much of doing the job, because they didn't do the job. And when I say they didn't do the job, I'm speaking from a city where our 35-year-old district attorney, Ed Rendell, then became the mayor, then became the governor, then became, Bill Clinton's BFF, and is still a dominant force in the National Democratic Party that can't win any elections. And it's also Arlen Specter, who went as a young graduate from the Warren Commission, where they were investigating the Kennedy assassination, for better or worse, to becoming the DA in Philly, and then he became the gateway to the federal judiciary and to some extent the gateway to the U.S. Supreme Court. And part of his legacy is what happened to Anita Hill in those hearings with Clarence Thomas. And part of that legacy is what just happened to Dr. Ford in the hearings involving Kavanaugh. So these district attorney positions have, to a very large extent, been launch pads for very ambitious politicians. That is a dangerous situation, especially when you marry that to the reality that the media have made a lot of money and they've gotten a lot of clicks off of describing terrible crimes, stoking fear, making money off that in ways that are not actually scientific. They are true. It is true that Charles Manson did the terrible things he did. Charles Manson is not a representative sample of criminal activity, nor should that kind of anecdotal reporting be a basis for policy. There are studies that have shown that in periods when homicide went up X, coverage of homicides went up 7X, which is how you get to this fact, and I hope you won't lose sight of this fact. For 30 years, Americans have been polled as to whether or not crime is going up or down. For 30 years, 65% of Americans have said it is going up. For 30 years, crime has been going down. Mm-hmm. When your steady diet in the media and your steady diet from the district attorney's office is we got to get tougher, we got to get tougher, we got to get tougher. Too many people in jail is not enough. That is how you get to the point where the U.S. population's incarcerated crew are 500% of what they were towards the beginning of my career. I was before I took this government job, I was out in the real world for 30 years doing this stuff. And Pennsylvania is worse. Pennsylvania is 800% increase in incarceration. It is the most incarcerated country in the world. There are more people of color who are on probation, parole, in jail, or in prison than were in slavery at the time of the Civil War. It is a higher rate of incarceration than during apartheid in South Africa. That is our country, which we call the land of freedom. And part of the reason it's not so obvious is that all those people we're talking about are put where you can't see them, and they're made so they can't vote, and you got to get permission even to bring a camera in to see what's going on. So it is, in fact, in my view, the civil rights issue of our time, and by our time I mean your time, because this is going to be a cycle, in my view, of probably 30 years duration to get criminal justice back to where it ought to be, so the U.S. is no longer the most incarcerated country in the world. So your schools, your public schools, and I went to public school, are not crumbling or being sold, as they are in the city of Philadelphia, to get to the point where you actually have a mental health safety net, which was destroyed and abandoned a long time ago as we stuck all of our mentally ill people into jails, until you get to the point where people actually regard addiction as a medical condition, provide treatment for it, instead of making a money fire out of that treatment money by building more jail cells. What we have seen here, and I'll stop in a minute, I promise.
No, take your time.
What we have seen here is, I guess, what I would call vote laundering. What we have seen is public officials stoke fear, get votes based on that fear, prove that they're the only wall against that fear by building jail cells, and they do it all with your tax money. That's what they do. Or if you're broke at the moment, then they'll do it with your future tax money. That's kind of how this works. And it's a cycle that's going on for a very, 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 very long time, and that will continue if we don't do something about it.
Terrific. And by the way, I'll just throw in as a footnote, a lot of those legislators who've been locking up disproportionately black and brown folk, people of color, but really, when Michelle Alexander, the reference you made, New Jim Crow, talking about black folk, a lot of those politicians, lawmakers have been black themselves. So it's not just a black and white issue, right? Over half the Congressional Black Caucus supported the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act that created the 100-to-1 powder crack disparity in sentencing and put mandatory minimums in federal law for the first time. Right. That was over half the Congressional Black Caucus behind that. You know, Charlie Rangel standing there while Reagan's signing it into legislation, grinning from ear to ear. Given all of that, though, D.A. Krasner, given how punitive the office has been of DA in Philadelphia and how punitive our thinking about crime and punishment has been for these last 30 years, how do you account for that I don't know, tectonic change, that earthquake that happened on an electoral basis, 75% in supporting a candidate who comes in and makes it clear that he views mass incarceration as a social justice problem, that he views money bail itself as a social justice issue, and police misconduct as a social justice issue. I know you got a lot of support from community groups like ACT UP, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Philadelphia, right? Groups that a lot of times you might think, like ACT UP, we're kind of anarchists. We don't get involved in politics, but they put signs in yards for you, right? And for Rao when she was running for a seat on the bench as well. So how were you able to get to corral that very kind of varied assortment of groups to support this new vision, this new conception of justice in Philadelphia?
It's a great question. So I think in a sort of a global sense, and we are seeing this nationally, when you have a place where there has been a desert of anything that looked like justice, but you have people who want justice, then that is a fertile ground where you actually can achieve this. Look, for example, at Wesley Bell, who just won by 13% when everybody thought he would lose to become the progressive district attorney in St. Louis County. St. Louis County is where Ferguson, Missouri is. It's arguably where Black Lives Matter, the organization, began. And Wesley Bell was a public defender. He's now, I believe, 42 years of age, but he was a public defender for about 19 years, who then became a city council person. I think he also was a judge for a period of time out there in Ferguson. He ran against an incumbent who was in office for 26 years, the same incumbent who couldn't find any way to charge any police officers in the Michael Brown case. He ran against an incumbent who was absolutely connected at the hip to the police department there, was in fact the son of a police officer who had been killed when the current DA was about 12 years of age. He ran against an incumbent who had the support of almost all of labor. And labor, frankly, doesn't, sometimes they do what's safe instead of what really is in their interest. But he had almost no support from labor, and he won by 13%. And if you look at the ingredients in play there, I think a lot of it is there was such a sense of injustice having been served upon the population in St. Louis County. You have an area, much like Philadelphia, where the home prices are not through the roof yet. You know, Philadelphia is of the 10 largest cities, and it's the 6th largest city. It has the 4th largest police force in the United States, but it's also the poorest of the 10 largest cities. It has certain areas of concentrated poverty that are more concentrated than other major urban centers. And it's also a very, very diverse population, 45% white, 45% black, 10% other people of color, right? So you have these ingredients of a population in St. Louis, in Philadelphia, where there is a history of the public perceiving mistreatment and unfairness by the court system and also by the police department. You have the possibility that it's not all going to be, no offense to anybody here, it's not all going to be 24-year-old techies who are making $250,000 straight out of college and maybe are not anywhere close to the actual lived experience of the criminal justice system, or maybe my experience, which is really a professional experience of 30 years of the criminal justice system. You have people in Philadelphia who are subject to the reality that 1 in 3 black men will experience jail in their lifetime. Think about what that means for the mother or the sister or the cousin or the people who live next door. Think of the extent to which that is a lived experience that informs what they do to an extent that is so much greater than, let's just say people who frankly look just like me, who are affluent, well-educated white liberals who get their news from the New York Times, right? In Philly, this didn't just mean that we won by a lot. This actually meant that the voter turnout Didn't quite double, but it went from a 12% turnout, this is a very off-year election, which it had been for 3 cycles, to a 19% turnout. And yes, there are anarchists who believed in their core it is immoral to vote. I am not going to claim anarchist support at this time. But all I can tell you is they turned out in massive numbers in Anarchyville. They did. It was like a 70% turnout in a place where people who for decades have been saying, I will not participate in the system. So there was a sense on the part of a lot of people who were totally alienated by mainstream politics in Philadelphia. There was a sense that they had a reason to vote, and they went out and voted. And the truth is they did have a reason to vote. We had a justice desert. It was time for the rains to come and the crops to come up, and they came out and did it. I don't know politically how easy that's going to be in San Diego, or how easy it's going to be in the extremely affluent sections of Oakland. We just saw a couple races with really good progressive candidates who lost by over 10%, in some instances by 20%. So I'm not saying it's going to be everywhere, but it is in at least 30 to 35 cities right now, and they're not small. You're looking at Brooklyn, you're looking at San Francisco, you're looking at Seattle, you're looking at Chicago, you're looking at Houston, Aramis Ayala in Orlando. We even have it going on in Corpus Christi, Texas with Mark Gonzalez. Joe Gonzalez just won, or is in the process of winning. Rachel Rollins in Boston. Wesley Bell in St. Louis County, which has a lot of symbolic significance for a lot of people who follow criminal justice. So what you are seeing is exactly what you said, things that would not have happened 5 or 10 years ago. They just wouldn't. They wouldn't happen in Philly either. We're seeing that it is changing, and it's changing in big ways. And honestly, a lot of what's changing is people of your age. Not all of you, but most of you. Our voters in Philly were millennials, and they were African Americans, especially 60-year-old women. Those were the votes I got. The ones who look like George W. Bush, which I do, couldn't get their votes. They didn't want anything to do with this. But it was the people who had lived that experience, who understood the decimation of their communities, who saw the consequences, and who had been seeing it for a very long time as this incredible weight of this increase in the number of people in jail came onto their shoulders. It was those people who jumped up.
So you nicely laid out for us what you have to do if you have a different conception of justice that's rooted in, rather than retribution, retaliation, and revenge, some kind of restoration, redemption, reconciliation model. You have a different conception of justice. Number one, you have to campaign for it and fight for it. You have to get out the votes for it, right? We got that so far, good. And that's just real. You can't just sit back and philosophize about this new conception of justice. You got to make it happen, right? Get out there in the streets. Now that it has happened and you were put in office on January 1st, now let's talk about how you've operationalized that different conception of justice, the concrete steps you've taken to consider all of the interests, not just, importantly, the interest of victims, but in the New Yorker article, they talked about one of your points being you also have an obligation that's broader, to the broader community. And for my tort students, you have to take a trans-harbor approach, not just look at it from any one individual standpoint, but what's in the best interest of the whole, and to take that seriously as a steward of these scarce resources that has to put them to the maximum use and think about those kids in those schoolrooms who aren't getting good schooling because all this money is going to imprison all these people that don't need to be imprisoned and put all of this money behind law enforcement, et cetera. So how have you actually operationalized this different vision of justice?
Well, it is in fact an ongoing struggle. It will be the nature of our term, if it's just one, or terms, if it's more than one, to do that. I think the key to it, frankly, is not to really care if you get reelected. The key to it is to try to just stick to what you think is the right thing to do. It's not to poll around the right thing to do. It's not to get consultants to tell you the right thing to do. It is to be as apolitical as you possibly can be and just do the things that you truly believe are right in a way that is not ideological that certainly has a philosophy behind it, but that is scientific, so that you're actually gathering the data to see if the things that you believe are true are working out. That might sound simple. It's kind of like what you do in medicine, but it is absolutely not what has been done in criminal justice for as long as I've been a lawyer. The coverage that you read in the newspapers is about individual crimes. It is Grimm's fairy tales. It is not actually about any criminological insight. When we came into the DA's office in Philly, we used to joke that if a criminologist walked in the door, we thought he might catch on fire, because we have all these great criminologists in Philadelphia. None of them had been consulted. None of them had ever been in the DA's office, but they did press conferences every 2 damn days in which they would talk about how they're going to stamp their feet and beat their chests and lock up some more people. I mean, that's sort of the reality of it. So the key to it to us is try to get to the place where we're having a conversation to the head and the heart, as they say, meaning we got the stats, but we also have the actual stories about real human beings that have always been the only currency of media around this stuff. And then we can communicate some truth around what's going on. In the same way you have a prevention model and a scientific approach to medicine, we should really have a prevention model and a scientific approach to criminal justice, because it's the kind of thing that works. So what did we do? So we came in and, we did a lot of things. One of the things we did is we asked a few people who'd been there for a long time to leave. And we did that not out of any personal retributive, as you put it, impulse. We did it because we knew for sure that they were not on the mission and they would never be. And if you are going to sail the ship a particular direction, then you need to be in control of who's sailing the ship. So we let far fewer than prior DAs had let go. We just did it for a different reason. They did it for politics. We did it based upon our program and our philosophy and what it was we wanted to achieve. And we identified some senior people who we knew would just be ice picking us the whole time we were there. And we were able to help them along to a different occupation.
And that's the key. These were senior people, supervisors, et cetera.
Some of them, there were some young ones who were doing outrageous, unethical, inappropriate things. There were plenty who were ethical. They just believed that, 22 years for selling marijuana made perfect sense. And life without parole or something of that sort for stealing a cell phone made perfect sense. That's how you stamp out crime. That's how it works. Never mind the cost. Never mind $1.1 million that could have been in public schools for people not involved in that particular court case. This is all play money. This is all monopoly money. We can just throw it wherever we want and do whatever we want at whatever cost to other branches. So there were them, and we have kept some of them. We just found places in the office where they could be as retributive as they want to be. For example, how about prosecuting some people for a high-level white-collar crime?
Mm-hmm.
That hasn't gone on in our society, has it? So they can get their retributive yayas out in that little unit, So we've done some of that. We came out with some policies because we recognize that most of the people in the office really do have good intentions. They are willing to carry out policies. They might just not know them because the culture was so ingrained for so many generations. And there was a hiring for a particular type of prosecutor, which is why we're here. We are recruiting, in case I didn't mention that earlier. So we came out with policies on, I think it was February the 15th. We came out with a litany of policies, including things like 25 different offenses, which were nonviolent offenses, not sex offenses, not felon in possession of a firearm, and not high-level white-collar crime, where we said bail should be $0. The presumption, unless you show us a good reason, like it's Pablo Escobar we got for jaywalking, so maybe we should lock him up. Unless you show us a good reason, there will be no money as an aspect of bail for these offenses. While that might sound radical, not really. It's what they've been doing in the District of Columbia for 30 years, where it is illegal to use money as an aspect of bail ever, in any case, and where they do really well at people showing up for court, and there being no recidivism, or very little, and extremely little violent recidivism. So we did what we could do, because we can't change state law in our Trump-loving state. We carved out these 25 offenses where the DA will come in the courtroom and say, we don't want cash as an aspect of bail. Other things maybe, but not that. We also came up with a policy saying that our sentencing guidelines are so screwed up, and our sentencing guidelines, by the way, do not force a judge to a particular sentence. They are considered a guideline in the truest sense, meaning they're advisory. You just look at them, you must consider them. Well, these wonderful guidelines, turns out, have absolutely zero criminological basis. They're nothing more than someone averaging the sentences that were given in Donald Trump-loving, Cole County, or Carbon County, or Center County, which, in case you didn't get the message, is Hillbillyville, with what was happening in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, which are the giant cities that have a completely different culture and a totally different reality when it comes to criminal justice. What they're prosecuting in Carbon County is prison assaults, because their major industry, in the absence of coal, is now prisons. Get the point? Mm-hmm. And they're prosecuting hunting violations, and they're prosecuting DUIs. That is not what we are doing in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. We are dealing with urban centers. There is real crime. We have to make real decisions about resources in these cities. So if you average that with Philadelphia, then you're going to be averaging up the sentences in Philadelphia, and especially if you don't average according to weight. If you don't weight these averages, if you simply say that the jurisdiction where they got 2 judges and a DA's office of 2 counts just as much as the city where you have a DA's office of 600 people, which is what we have, almost 300 attorneys. If you count them as being equal players, guess what? The sentences just went up in Philadelphia, and you end up with an 800% increase in the state prison population in Pennsylvania, as opposed to an atrocious 500% level nationally. So we said, see those sentencing guidelines? For these nonviolent, non-sex offenses, go under them. Those numbers are screwed up. We're going under them. And it became the policy that for these categories of offenses, the offer, if we felt it was necessary to have a conviction, would be below the bottom of the sentencing guidelines. So that's 45 days in. I mean, we have been there now for about 10 months, but that was 45 days in. We also said something truly outrageous and atrocious. Are you ready for this, Professor? Okay.
I'm holding on.
Hang on. Everybody hang on. That when you do a sentencing and you're the prosecutor, you have to actually tell the judge how much it's going to cost, right? So if you are... Thank you. Are you applying?
Mostly PD offices.
Oh, we'll talk about that. I've been a PD longer than you, so we'll talk about that. So, you know, we said you're going to say what it costs. If you want a year, because this chronically mentally ill, homeless person who's suffering from addiction has done his 5th or 6th or 7th retail theft and has stolen food or maybe batteries, one more time, if you really want your 1 to 2 years in state prison, and yes, I saw this as a public defender go on, then you get to tell the judge why that's worth $42,000 that could have been spent on housing and treatment for this individual. You know, the idea was never that this would really change our request for 25 years for, you know, a truly atrocious crime. The idea was that this would make our attorneys, especially our youngest attorneys, think for a minute about the way the money's being spent and the value of those expenditures. So those were the kinds of policies we came up with. Silly me, I thought it was common sense. We thought that, like, there'll be a little flurry. The local papers will beat us up again because that's all they know how to do. But it actually attracted a lot of national attention. And not so long ago, I heard you talking about James Foreman's book, which is called Locking Up Our Own, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize with Kendrick Lamar, by the way. Not for the same work, but both for pretty great work. But anyway, so I ended up not that long ago recruiting at another school where James Foreman happens to teach.
We won't say its name.
We won't say its name.
New Haven.
Yeah. But anyway, it turned out that he had actually taught our policies, meaning he had presented our policies to his defense clinic. You heard defense, right? Defense clinic. And they had discussed them there. And we have found that this has happened in many different places, that, you know, the person who is teaching a combination of a divinity graduate student course and a law student course at Boston College, or the undergrad professor teaching about prisons at Georgetown or wherever it is, they are teaching from these very straightforward policies because, I don't know, I don't actually think they're all that original, but I think that they might present a short summary of where criminal justice may go in some of the many different areas where it needs to change. What was the question?
Well, no, I like this. I like this a lot. And I'm gonna take you one further place with this, how you actually operationalize the role of the progressive prosecutor and give that conception concrete substance. And I'm thinking in particular now about how you speak to the justice concerns of the victims. right? Because
Yeah.
you talk about balancing sentencing and making sure the punishment fits the blame and that sort of thing, and that's important, focus on the defendant. But I know you have some programs for victims that you do work with, and I think a lot of people wonder about, does this progressive conception of justice also give care and concern to the interest of victims? So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I could actually talk a lot about that, but let me try to cut to the chase. So, it was my experience as a defense attorney that what I saw pretty often was a prosecutor would be the main link to the victim or the victim's family. The prosecutor, frankly, has somewhat mixed motivations. Their primary motivation in an office that only values convictions and long sentences is to get a conviction and a long sentence, because that is your report card and that is how you advance. So the toolkit that most prosecutors had was as follows. I know it's terrible what happened to your family. The death of your son is something that you will never overcome, which is true. So we're going to get you a long sentence. We're going to make sure that Mr. So-and-so gets the death penalty. Would you like the death penalty? Okay, you can have the death penalty. Or we're going to make sure it's life without the possibility of parole for this 19-year-old. That's what we're going to do for you. And that was the full range of options that were presented. When you got to the end of the case and the prosecutor had either achieved or not what they sought, which was to put someone in jail, where the only thing that person had to do was not escape, a lot of the victims often felt used. They often felt like, all right, so that person's in jail forever or for a really long time, but I don't actually know everything about how and why this crime occurred, which is one thing that we know that victims need to know. I haven't really had any treatment for this tremendous trauma that we've gone through. I've got, the police department saying that somehow my son was involved because he had drugs in his back pocket, so the state won't pay the funeral expenses. If there was a lawsuit, and this is something I saw as well, drunk driver runs over a young mother, right? And a couple of very, very young kids are left. If I have a lawsuit, my civil attorney turns to the prosecutor and says, help me with the evidence. The prosecutor says, no, I closed the file, bye. I mean, this is what was going on. It wasn't like a wide range of options and support were being provided for victims. What was essentially being done is victims were being told, your justice looks like that person getting the death penalty or that person in jail for a long time, and there's nothing else you need, and when I'm done with this file, I'm going to close it. So, Vera Institute has written on this at length, and the fact is that victims need a lot more than that. Sometimes their needs are very specific. They want to know when a person's getting out of jail because they are fearful. They want to know that there's some kind of treatment going on so that when this person comes out, this person will not be a danger to them or someone else. Sometimes they simply want to know, as I did when I got stabbed up pretty good about 10 years ago. Sometimes they simply want to know, why the hell did this happen? Was the person who did this to me jacked up on drugs? Is the person who did this to me someone who has a long criminal record or not? They want some closure. They want something to come from that. That has not been provided. So when we came in, we first of all changed the chief of that unit. We brought in a woman named Movida Johnson, who is a fascinating woman. She has her master's from the University of Pennsylvania in social work. She is an African-American black Muslim woman whose father was murdered, whose brother was murdered, and whose son, who was in college and living outside of the city of Philadelphia, because she was so fearful that something like that would happen to him, was in Philadelphia just picking up his sister, who was pregnant when he was murdered in a case of mistaken ID by an angry boyfriend, right? So we picked someone who had lived the reality of grieving and being a victim of the worst kinds of crimes you can have, but also had the social work background, brought her in, and she has done remarkable things. I don't want to take too much credit for it other than picking the right person, but so one thing we did, for example, there have never been advocates who went to the home of a homicide victim at the time of the homicide. It has always been the job of hardworking, beleaguered homicide detectives to go to that home and say, Mrs. Smith, I hate to tell you, but your son just got murdered a block away. You got any suspects? Can you tell, would somebody have something against him? Do you feel in danger? And these detectives, needless to say, are primarily there to go solve the crime. And if you don't solve it in 24 hours, a lot of times you will never solve it. Our clearance rate in Philly is only about 40% for homicide. So with no real training in addressing the trauma and without the ability to do their job as detectives and remain on site and help the family through the process, there was often a hostile relationship that developed, and I think unfairly, between the families and the detectives. So Movida went out and got $1.5 million so that we could have 12 unique advocates around the city, each covering a different zone. And these advocates have all experienced terrible victimization in their own lives. They have trainings in trauma. And they are the ones who now go with the detectives. They are the ones who tell, Mrs. Smith what has happened to her son. And then while the detectives are going off and doing their job, they are the ones who can take Mrs. Smith to the morgue to identify her son, who can fill out the paperwork in order to try to get funding for funerals, because as you probably know, the people who die are usually poor. So, and they can arrange for trauma counseling. They can simply sit there for 4 hours while the family is dealing with the reality of victimization, which is you stop thinking normally. You can't move. I mean, it's just like a 1,000-pound weight has been put on your shoulders. You may not think normally for years as a consequence of something like this. So that's an example of something that we have done. And we take that obligation very seriously. We take it seriously not just for that reason, but because there is a very clear and documented phenomenon of people being victimized and then victimizing others when their trauma is not addressed. It essentially psychologically boils down to a terrible thing happened to you when you lost control. So you regain that control by imposing that terrible thing on others. This has become even more vivid for me because Philadelphia had more juvenile lifers than any other city in the world. Pennsylvania had more juvenile lifers than any other state in the world because other countries don't do this shit, okay? Mm-hmm. And so our administration has had to make recommendations about resentencings for about over 100 of those juvenile lifers, which I do all the time with the judge. It's very helpful, by the way, having a judge who heard homicide cases for, well over 20 years, was a homicide prosecutor and also a defender, because we have a real balanced view on this kind of stuff. But anyway, getting to the point, which is not my specialty, getting to the point, how many times have I read, as a child, this defendant watched his grandmother, who was intoxicated, fall down the staircase with a glass in her hand. The glass shattered and jammed through her throat, and she bled out all over the stairs, and there he is at age 16, and he has cut the throat of someone. Or, at age 12, this person watched his father being killed with a hammer. At age 17, he's robbing the fast food store where he worked on payday, and he killed the coworker with a hammer. This is real. You don't deal with people's trauma. You don't deal with their adverse childhood experiences. You will see some of them come back and deal with it in extremely destructive ways. So to me, properly handling, caring for victims is the same thing as crime prevention. Now, we have also seen that there is a very, the notion that all victims are out for blood and they're out for the death penalty, not true. Some are. I've literally tried death penalty cases as a defense attorney in which the highly religious family of the victim told the prosecutor they didn't want the death penalty. Prosecutors in the courtroom lying about what they want and pursuing the death penalty. That stuff really does go on. I've also seen instances in which what is really wanted and probably needed is something like the Juvenile Restorative Justice program that's been so successful in Oakland, which essentially, let me just be quick about it. Put the kid in the room, the kid perp in the room with the victim. This is for stuff that can be fairly serious, like a no weapons robbery, or it can be a burglary when no one's home. Reasonably serious stuff. And the kid has to own up. None of this will be used in a courtroom later, so it's an effort to resolve it. Kid's got to own up. Why they did what they did, how they were doing. This is kind of a rough day for the kid. Victim sits there and talks about how terrible it was to come home and have your window broken, have someone who had gone through your things lose your grandma's ring forever, and have your handshake every time you came home for the next 3 months, not knowing if there's someone on the other side, that you totally lost that sense of safety and privacy. And they come out of this thing with a contract, which basically says, kid will do XYZ academically, kid will get a job to pay the restitution for the broken window. And often it also says the kid will use some special skill. Let's just say, and this is a true story, let's just say the kid's a good painter or something, right? So the kid's going to do a painting of something specified by the victim. In the case I'm aware of, it was a painting of Tinkerbell. And so here comes this oil painting of Tinkerbell. I know this sounds like some hippie bullshit, I know that. And I say that to a bunch of Californians. And I even say it before 420. But here's the truth. The level of satisfaction among the victims is much higher, according to the polling that has been done, than for those victims who went to court, juvenile court, and although you haven't experienced it, I have, for the most part, went to court 2 or 3 times, stuff got delayed, they sat outside the courtroom, may have never even gone in the courtroom, and then they're told later by some, no offense, kid who's 2 years out of law school, oh, we got you justice, what'd you get? Well, he's going to a juvenile home and he's got a permanent adjudication. That level of satisfaction was much lower than for the people who had that face-to-face and entered into that agreement and saw that agreement satisfied. That is not my opinion. That is what the polling said, and the level of recidivism for the juveniles was much lower. Why? I don't know. Who cares? It worked, okay? I know it's some hippie shit, but it worked. So, we all need to think about going more in that direction because it works.
I'll just throw in real quickly that we here at SC have seen that model in action when I've taken some of the students on my seminar up to San Quentin. We did a couple years ago, 22 sat down with lifers without parole, for about 40 of them, and they've had a program going on up there called No More Tears for years, in which mothers of murder victims come together with these lifers without parole, and now my students were sitting there and we all sat down for a day, and here's how a typical session would go. If there were 20 minutes, say, the mother who lost the person to homicide, like you described, or in some other way said, this is my loved one. Here's a picture, here's what he or she did, here's, and you go through the whole photo album and, kind of feel that loss. And then you'd have one of the lifers stand up and say, here's the person, here are the people I injured. Here's the family that I tore apart with my crime. And let me tell you, the person who did that was depraved, because in some of these cases, there were some depraved acts, and, committed. And then, so they'll spend the first half of their time saying that, and then the second half they'll say, now let me tell you how I got to be that person. Let me tell you about the foster care home and the cigarette burns and being thrown in the trunk as discipline for 6 and 8 hours as you're growing up, and how I got to that place. And both the mothers of the murder victims, my students said it was one of the most transformative experiences that they'd had to see how that can happen, and it wasn't quite what you had because these were lifers without parole, so there was no, but there was still some kind of closure that they were able to feel by being able to reach out to people who had been victimized and say, I'm sorry, and try to explain, and then the mothers themselves kind of felt. One more question I want to get to, and then get some from the audience. D.A. Krasner, that came out of the New Yorker piece that I think was fabulous. I hope you all have read it. If you haven't, check it out. Great writing and a very gripping narrative. They tell about how this moment came to be, this extraordinary, unpredictable moment 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But one of the things I found interesting is, kind of one of the key questions of professional ethics is how do you reconcile who you are with what you do? When there's a tension between who you are and what you do. What do you do about that tension? Mm-hmm. And that's what kept you from going into the DA's office when you were at Stanford as a student, when I read an article and you were hearing about the conception of justice that was informing practice by prosecutors in Philadelphia's DA office. So you step back. But now that the tide has turned, now that we've had, under these evolving standards, conceptions of justice, we've had this kind of sea change, and there's reckoning now. Hillary Clinton had to reckon with super predators.
Yes, she did.
Right? And that whole moral framework. And how when the moral framework shifts like it has in a profound way, at least within the office for sure, and by the voters, 75% of whom put you in that position, what happens to those people who've been operating under the old conception, the draconian one, the one that we view now as morally obtuse? Because it was. 25 to life for a cell phone is morally obtuse, right? But they are invested in that, their body and soul. And in the article, you had some of the DAs, 12 former prosecutors when you were running. Nearly all of whom had worked under Williams, who's doing 5 years for bribery and corruption. He was a former DA in your role. Wrote a letter in which they said, while it might be demoralizing to work for someone who is federally indicted, imagine working for someone who has openly demonized what you do every day. It read, why work for someone that reviles a career that you are passionate about? And they picked up on, some threads like that in some other places when you had the March 8th former prosecutions held an event at the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge, right, in which Ed McCann said, those of you who have tried homicide cases, he said, when something like this happens, there's a natural reaction. You say, I gave everything to this job, to this work, sometimes too much, and this is my payoff. He went on, if you're feeling that, it's completely natural, and I'm sure you aren't alone. The anger won't pass, and it shouldn't, but questioning whether your commitment and talent and heart were wasted on this job, that will pass, right? So, and one of the things that came out, I'm going to quote you some of your own language from the article. It's so good. They are being forced to look back on their entire careers and say to themselves, we're talking about judges now who are sitting on the bench sometimes who are former prosecutors, and now you're going before these folks who are deeply invested in what was the prevailing paradigm that has now been upended. Did I get it all wrong as a prosecutor? They're being forced to ask, have I gotten it all wrong as a judge? All these years coming down with 25 years when it should have been 10, and 10 when it could have been 2. He went on, you went on. It takes a pretty remarkable human being who turned down big law firms, turned down big money to do public service, to say, damn, I screwed up. I've been doing it wrong all this time. I think I'll just fall into line with what these progressive prosecutors want to do. That's hard. Can you talk about that?
There's no doubt that that's part of what we're up against. It's a very, very interesting situation, and it exists at two levels. One level is, who are we talking about? Because you'll notice that these prosecutors are talking about themselves. I hear public defenders, and I was a public defender, do the same thing. I hear public defenders say, I could never put someone in jail. I could never prosecute. Well, who the hell are they talking about? And who are these people talking about? It's me, 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 me. I thought the whole idea of public service was we were supposed to worry about who we serve. I thought that was the whole point. But all that they want to talk about is what I gave up, the hard weekends I put in, all that sort of thing. So at that level, we need to view it at that level, right? That is a misconception. That is the history of kings and queens. That is not the history of their subjects. The other part of it, though, is, the left, and I am a member of the left, as you may have figured out, the left claims they're not fond of stereotypes. Really? So in your mind, a Philly cop is what, a 55-year-old guy who looks like Archie Bunker with a crew cut who's white? Not exactly. About 30% of them are actually officers of color. And that's the organization that endorsed me. Yeah. While the other ones were endorsing Donald Trump in a city that was 85% for Hillary and did everything they could to shut me down. Well, we have to be honest about this. It is not the case that all these prosecutors either went in with bad intentions or did the wrong thing all the time. That is not true. What is true is that the worst among them are completely unwilling to hold themselves accountable after spending their whole careers holding everybody else accountable, and frankly, holding everybody else far more accountable than they probably should have. They own this. They made this country what it is. And I'm speaking of the worst of them. I'm not speaking of the best of them. The best of them are supervisors in my office, and they're friends of mine for 20 plus years. But there is a group, not stereotyping, there is a group among them who will never be able to say, I did the wrong thing all this time. It didn't make us safer. It wrecked our public schools, because it's a hard thing to say. I had a conversation with a pretty remarkable guy by the name of Ted McKee. Ted McKee was the Chief Justice of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia, just stepped down. He is an African-American judge now in his 70s who began his career as an assistant United States attorney. He then became a judge on the Court of Common Pleas with the Honorable Carolyn Engel Teman, same court where my wife, Lisa Rao, is currently a judge and has been for 17 years. And then he ascended to the Third Circuit, and then he became the CJ. This is a guy who walks around a grocery store wearing a Mother Jones t-shirt, just so we're all clear. So he is not necessarily your average notion of what a judge might be. And he and I had lunch, and he said to me, you know, all those years I really thought I was doing the right thing by having very long periods of supervision. We were talking specifically about how harmful it turns out, and this is science-based, it is to have supervision that is more than 3 years in most cases, and how it actually makes people more likely to end up back in jail as opposed to less likely. And he just said, look, I thought I was really doing the right thing all those years, 10 years of supervision, 15 years of supervision. It's going to keep this young man on the right track. And I look back on it, I know I did the wrong thing. You know, I know all those years when I thought I was doing the right thing, I was doing the wrong thing. There are not too many people who can do that, who can look back on their careers and say, damn, I really screwed it all up. And I gave up a lot of money. And I patted myself on the back of the head the whole time saying, boy, I'm virtuous. Oh, I'm doing what's in the public interest, but I was completely wrong. That's a hard thing to do. And, you know, when you try to bring about institutional change, you're going to be up against that. I have the luxury of having felt a certain kind of way about this for a very long time. And sure, I was a part of a very flawed system, and I own that, but I didn't do what a lot of them did. You know, I didn't take the kid who could have 2 years if he pled guilty and say, now that he tried the case, I want 20. Because the offense of trying your case is worth 18. I didn't do that, and some of them did. And they didn't even necessarily do it saying, I feel like being a racist. I feel like being evil. I feel like doing the wrong thing. They just did it because it was their culture, and it was all around them, and maybe they weren't the biggest critical thinkers in the world, which is why I'm here at USC. I am here at USC to recruit, and the people I am looking for, may I just do this?
Please.
All right. So the people I'm looking for are the ones who will find the following argument interesting, and that argument is coming from an ex-public defender, a guy who did some court-appointed criminal work for almost all of his 30 years. That argument is that if you have the option of being a progressive prosecutor, which is not my dad's DA, or of being a public defender, then it may just be that you want to figure out what your priority is. Is your priority you? Are you saying to yourself, I could never put anyone in jail. I could never prosecute anyone. I could never do that. Are you worried about you, or are you worried about the ones that you propose to serve? Because if you are going into criminal justice from USC, you are giving up money. Make no mistake. And if you are going into criminal justice from USC, you are not picking a particularly easy life. So we all know you're doing it out of some idealistic impulse, some interest in criminal justice in general. I think the more moral choice is to be a progressive prosecutor, because it's not just about railing against evil and shaking your fist at an office that always does the right thing, when you have the option of going into that office and having that power and exercising that discretion in a way so that you serve those people you claim to care so much about. And now that I've called all you future public defenders immoral hypocrites, there's a reason I'm doing it. And you know what the reason is, because I think people who have an impulse to want to be public defenders are probably the right kind of people. If they would be comfortable with a truly progressive prosecutor's office, I think that's what we're looking for. I recognize and I respect, having been a criminal defense attorney for 30 years, that there is this beauty in being the second most despised person in the courtroom. There is this beauty in trying to make sure that the truth comes out, or there's proportionality, or that maybe somebody remembers the Constitution once in a while. There is beauty in that. That is what I did for a long time. You know, I was fortunate enough to win a lot of cases, and 30 years later, the system was so much worse than before I started winning all those cases. What we've been able to do in 10 months in the DA's office obliterates what I was able to do in 30 years as a criminal defense attorney. So now, I'm not saying that if you're in a jurisdiction where my dad's DA is the DA, go be a DA. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, hell no, go be a public defender. But if you have the option of being in a jurisdiction, you have the chance to be in at the beginning of what I view as a 30-year arc of turning around the biggest civil rights issue of our time. If you have the option to be a part of history as opposed to reading about it, misreported, then you should do it. Yes, there is coverage in the New Yorker. This morning, there is an article in the New York Times, which is about our office. It goes into in great length. If you have nothing better to do, there will be an interview on Samantha Bee tomorrow night, which will only come out poorly for me, I'm sure. None of this is about me. It really isn't. It truly isn't. I'm the second most unlikely politician of our time, the first being Bernie. But none of this is about me. This is about the reality that there is a national movement and there is a movement in Philadelphia. It is for real. And I am nothing more than a technician for that movement. But I need some technicians. At this point, we are going to 29 schools all over the country. We want the best and the brightest. We also want the ones who have not broken their moral compass just yet. That's what we want, and that is exactly why we are here. We are at 4 schools in California, a bunch of schools in Texas, up and down the East Coast. And so for those of you who have not signed up for interviews today with Judge Teman and me, please go to Career Services, come on up, let us know about your interests, because we're hiring.
And just before questions now, let me make one last pitch about Philly, because it's hard to get y'all to leave sunny Southern California, or Cali generally. And coming from Stanford,
Yep.
You've been there, you know how tough it can be. But I'm also a product of a Better Chance, which takes kids out of inner city areas and puts them in boarding kind of situations. And I went to high school at Lower Merion, Kobe Bryant's high school.
Oh, no kidding.
On the main line.
There you go.
So I am a big time, if I wasn't in LA, I would be in Philly. And I'm not just making that up. I mean, I just love Philly that much, it's an amazing town in a lot of ways, and it's relatively temperate. It's not quite New England in terms of the temperature. It's relatively temperate, but the history and the lifestyle is just amazing. So, questions now. Let's start. Was there a hand back here?
I just want to say I'm with Career Services, so I'm here to help the
Right on,
District
yes.
Attorney's Office. Just so you know, at this point, only 2 L's and 3 L's can interview with District Attorney Krasner, but I'm sure if there are 1 L's in the audience that are interested, as you know, you can't apply until December 1st. We can collect your information
Wonderful.
and forward it on to your office.
Yep, thank you.
I have the list if you want to sign up.
Great.
Very good. Over here. And then here.
So, Jody Krasner, I just wanted to. Oh yeah. All right. My name's Eric, and I just wanted to ask. I would love to come work for you, but what I would like even more is to be able to bring, to be able to see change in my home state of California.
Right.
And can you talk more about what that arc looks like about bringing change? Because this summer, seeing a lot of elections being lost in San Diego and in Oakland and up in Sacramento, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and especially in the electoral realm. Is the electoral process the only method that you see for change, or is there other ways to do it? And if I was to come work for you, then if I was lucky enough to do that, then how do you see that potentially making its way back to California and out into other states?
So I'll answer the second part first. We very much view our office as being a couple things, and one of those things is a place where people may land and make their careers, but the other thing is as an on-ramp for progressive leadership for the future. We know that when you go out to hire a bunch of generals, instead of doing what they've done for 30 years, which is hiring privates who would never run against them, we know that when you go to hire generals, they're going to leave. They're going to leave at some point. They're going to go on and become whatever, chief of staff for city council or judge somewhere, or they're going to do all sorts of other fascinating things with nonprofits or maybe chief public defender somewhere. I think that's great. There is a lot to have been said if you came out in a certain time in New York from law school for having worked for Elizabeth Holtzman, who at her time was viewed as a trailblazing progressive prosecutor in Brooklyn, who was above corruption and then later was one of the first women in the U.S. House. And the people who did that 30 years ago talk about that as being formative. They are all over the country. They're doing amazing things all over the country. But they went through that office. You know, we would very much like for Philadelphia's DA office to be the destination office, to be the on-ramp for progressive leadership. It ain't that big a deal to take a couple different bars and go from, you know, and go from Philadelphia back to California when you actually have the skill set, you have the experience to see what worked and didn't work in Philly. I mean, step on my head, it's okay. You can come to Philly, watch us, you know, do some things right and do some things wrong, and then you can go back and do everything right, maybe. So that's part two of it. As for part one, I mean, if you really want to stay in California and you want to do criminal justice, then one thing you can do is go work for some of the progressive prosecutors in California. We do not all necessarily feel exactly the same way about everything, but there are some really, really talented, interesting prosecutors here you should look at. One of them is Diana Becton, who is what, Contra Costa? Is that Contra Costa?
Yeah.
Okay, another one is Tori Verber Salazar, who is in San Joaquin County. Mike Fewer in LA does some pretty interesting stuff. It's mostly misdemeanors, but you know, is one of the founders of Prosecutors Against Gun Violence nationally with Cy Vance, and has done some remarkable work. It might be a place to go for a bit. In terms of other ones in California, George Gascon in San Francisco, actually, I'm not going to tell you look, just by mentioning their names doesn't mean I'm endorsing everything that happened, right? But some of the stuff he has done has been really good. Or Jeff Rosen, who deals with the mean streets of Silicon Valley, where the starting salary is, I think, 120 grand. You know, these are forward-thinking people. Now, Gascon is out. He's already said he's not going to run again, and we don't know who's going to follow Gascon, so that's something to watch carefully if you're thinking about working there. But those are places where you could look. They might be really good places, you know, to cut your teeth as you're figuring out what to do next, if you're so foolish as not to apply to Philly.
Hi, Dee Krasner. I'm a student and I'm interested in a career in the criminal justice system. So I'm really inspired by the work you're doing. And my question's kind of in line with what you were talking about in terms of some opposition you might be facing. In conversations with Philly activists, like I'm hearing that the Fraternal Order of Police is employing really aggressive tactics, kind of in opposition to the changes that are coming. And I'm just wondering, how do you plan on dealing with the corrupt FOP? Sorry, let me rephrase. How do you plan on working with the police union other than prosecuting, officers that have already committed crimes against the citizens? Like, what initiatives are there? How are you kind of mobilizing the citizens or the people in Philly to help in this battle or in this work?
So a great question. First of all, you know, once again, this is where people like me have to be careful because we tend to stereotype. The reality is that the Philadelphia Police Department is not actually well represented by the leadership of the monolithic bargaining unit, which is the Fraternal Order of Police. The FOP has always been white dominated. It is, you know, in a city that is 7-1 Democratic. They endorsed Donald Trump for president. And the leadership is racist. I mean, let's just call it what it is. That's reality. It is not representative, for example, of the Guardians, who are the African American Officers Association. They represent 25 to 30%. They do not like illegal stop and frisk. They endorsed my candidacy, the one person who had not been a prosecutor, at least in the general. So it is always a mistake, I think, to think of them monolithically. There are more women in the police department in Philly than you might imagine. It is a younger department than one might imagine. So even though the leadership of the union is over here, I think a lot of the rank and file are actually with us, and they are not thrilled about locking up people suffering from addiction or locking up mentally ill people. They're not thrilled about that. They may be financially motivated to want that because they got a lot of overtime dragging those people into jail and then going to court to testify against them. So that's a complication. There's structural issues that we're going to have to change before they can maybe feel it quite the way that they need to feel it. But, you know, that is one part of the script. The other part of the script is that the police commissioner in Philly, and it's the second commissioner in a row, is actually pretty progressive, pro-integrity, modern thinking commissioner, and the commissioner and I get along very well. You know, we have conversations by cell phone all the time. I let him know my next unexpected move And that allows him to do what he has to do in terms of his own resources. So it is going to be a struggle, and we are never going to get along with the current leadership of the Fraternal Order of Police. That's actually okay. I mean, in a way, and I say this as someone who represented activists for free for 25 years, and so I really got to watch the arc of the progress of the anti-AIDS movement, the fight for clean needles, the fight for generic AIDS drugs in Africa, the fight to get Big Pharma to do the research that the president didn't want to fund them to do, and its close connection to LGBTQ rights. As I watched that arc for 30 years, what I saw is that the usual cliche is true, which is that at first they ignore you. We're past that. Then they laugh at you. Sound familiar? Then they fight you. Well, we've gotten all the way up to fight, right? That's pretty good. They were laughing at the beginning of the campaign. Now they're dumping all kinds of money into fighting us. And then, of course, part 4 is you win, right? So in terms of the arc of how this goes, both nationally and locally, when they get all fired up like that, we're doing a good thing. My mother came out of high school at 16, graduated high school at 16, and she was a tent evangelist. Believe it or not, all true. I'm from the Midwest. You've heard of it, perhaps. You fly over it. But she used to say, you know you're doing something good when you angry up the devil. Well, we must be doing something good, because there's a couple people who should be angry about what's going on. So I actually am very heartened by taking this 2-mile away view of what's going on, that we are progressing pretty nicely along our arc. And no, it's not me. It is a movement. It doesn't really matter who finishes it. I know I won't finish it. I intend to be on a beach somewhere. But it is, in fact, your generation. You are the ones who get to finish this 30-year arc and get to take us back to a place of balance when it comes to criminal justice.
It's important to note that the Black Police Union in Philadelphia did support your candidacy in the general election, number one, kind of going in. And number two, here in Philadelphia, I've been surprised, not here in Philadelphia, that's my old home. Here in LA, I've been surprised at some of the responses I've had when I've been down at the police commission meetings here with Charlie Beck, when he was the chief of police, and the officers are lined up on the wall, and I'm having a very tense exchange with Chief Beck in the police commission room, and I'm hearing these voices from officers saying, yeah, go. That's right. Amen. Right on. From the rank and file. Wow. So you'd be surprised, kind of, it isn't a monolith. We got to remember that.
Hi, my name's Sanat, and I'm a 1L here. And today my question is about dealing with a divergence in attitudes within society as to what constitutes a fair punishment. So just a quick background, I'm from Singapore, and I came to America 4 years ago. And over the past 4 years, I've been going around. I lived in Florida for a while, where people think very differently than California, as I've assumed so far. Sure. And I'm trying to understand how we can identify and deal with these diverging attitudes. Now in Singapore is known for being one of the hardest countries on drugs. So growing up, if somebody was caught with like a quite small amount of weed, they could probably go to jail forever, or maybe even get hung. And today we're living in a world where Canada just legalized it, and it's legal over here. So at some point in my life, I plan to go back to Singapore and be part of this movement to change our sentencing when it comes to, at least with drugs and other things. And I wanted to ask you, in your experience, in Philly especially, how do you deal with the different populations of the city that may have a differing attitude on what is a good punishment and what is not, or what is a fair punishment and what is not?
First of all, what you're trying to do is a hell of a lot harder than what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
So number one, please don't get hung. That would be a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Please be wise and strategic about your timing. But I think it's wonderful that you want to do something like that. How do you deal with it? Well, one way to deal with it is not deal with it. One way to deal with it is just speak the truth about what you truly and honestly believe to be the case. And then people either accept it or they don't. There's a long political tradition of having consultants who are going to tell you what you should think, or polling, around what people should think. Every consultant and every person who did polling when I started my campaign told me not to say what I said, and they were all wrong. So I don't know that you really need to worry about that. I think you certainly need to be culturally aware of when you need to take your foot off the gas pedal and give it a little more time. But I don't really think you need to have a break there that shouldn't be. You know, it's just easier to come out and say, as I did, that I am no fan of the death penalty. It's just easier to come out and say we have too much incarceration. There is a moment that happened in this campaign which none of us really anticipated, but to me really stands out. And that was a moment when I'm sitting up on a stage with, I think it was 6 other candidates who are running for DA, and all of them were saying, I was a prosecutor, I was a prosecutor, I was a prosecutor, and that fool wasn't. And they're all pointing at me. And there's a bunch of white guys there, and they got glasses, and some of them got last names that start with the same letter as mine. And, you know, and meanwhile, I'm giving them hell because I've been trying cases for a long time. And as soon as everybody identified me as the one who had not been the prosecutor, I saw all these little old church ladies pull 3x5 cards out of their purses, take out a pen, or as they call them in Philly, an ink pen, and start writing down my name. That nondescript white dude with the glasses who looks like the other nondescript white dudes, oh, he's the one who was not a prosecutor. Okay, and they wrote it down. Well, the consultants had it all wrong. They do not and did not understand where people are. So just do you. Just speak truth. And then you either get power or you don't. That's how it goes.
Hi, my name is Abby. I'm a 2L here. My question is about your goal on tackling police misconduct. My understanding is that the work the DAs do really largely depend on the work police officers do. So how do you plan on dealing with that tension between when your office and the work you do and the structure of your office really depends on the work the police department does?
So may I ask you a question, not to single you out, so please don't take it that way, but it seems to me that your question, and I've heard this question from many, many people in different places, may be premised on the idea that police officers wouldn't want to do their job because they feel the DA may hold them accountable. Am I correct in that, or am I not correct in that?
I guess my understanding is that a lot of DAs hesitate to be hard on police misconduct because they fear that police officers in turn wouldn't then support their jobs.
That is kind of what I thought was underlying the question. But I want you all to think for a second, because I hear that question a lot, and I know exactly what you're saying, what that means. That means we are all victims of a kidnapping. That means it's not just that we will pay our police force of, it's about maybe 6,000 people in Philadelphia. It's that they can either do or not do their job if they feel like it. That is a kidnapping. When did we get to the point where we are at the mercy of police officers who are paid to do a certain job? How would you feel if firefighters said, well, hey, you arrested one of us for domestic violence, so we're just going to let the houses burn? I mean, how would anybody feel about that? I think the question itself, which is an excellent question, is really indicative of the kind of a culture that the leadership of the FOP, not the rank and file police officers who don't say this kind of stuff, but the leadership of the FOP is making a point. And their point is, we are in charge. We will work if we feel like it. And if you as DA are going to apply the law to us equally, then we're not going to work. And my answer to that is pretty simple, which is, oh, would you like to be prosecuted for theft of services? How does that work for you? Oh, would you like to be prosecuted for obstructing the administration of justice? We cannot exist in a society where the exchange, the transaction is that people who are elected to uphold the law will give a free pass to police officers in order to get them to do their job as they line up for a paycheck every couple weeks. That is just unacceptable to me. I also think that it is fundamentally contrary to how most police officers actually feel. I think they really value what they do. Most of them became police officers because they wanted to solve problems or because they wanted to help society. A lot of them really like the excitement and the activity that goes into it. I think all of us probably would. And they are not well served by, this union. Let me not diss all unions, but this particular union in Philadelphia, the Fraternal Order of Police, which has for many, many years essentially said, we'll work if we feel like it. No, you won't. This mongoose and this snake are going to do battle. That's not how this is going to work. Somebody's going to win.
This is going to be the last question, wrapping it up.
Hi, DA Krasner. Thanks so much for being here and for all the change you brought about in the past 10 months.
Didn't you say you were going to apply? No.
Well, so I wanted to give a brief introduction. My name's Michael. I'm actually one of the stubborn, self-interested PD students who says that I'll never put somebody in jail.
Oh, the immoral ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so my question, obviously, one of the pillars, the foundations of the work that you're doing is at an attempt to bring an end to mass incarceration. I was wondering what the end goal was, what the end of mass incarceration looks like to you.
Boy, that's a tough one. So part of me wants to get into a philosophical discussion with you about how the whole world seems to be about absolutes. I think prison abolition is a wonderful thing. I really do. I don't know that it's at all realistic or wise, but I don't actually have to decide that right now, because in my lifetime, it would be a great achievement if we were to get the rate of incarceration down 80%, which would have us back where it was in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s. That would be a great achievement. So I honestly don't have to necessarily worry too much about that absolute, as much as I think it is a high ideal and would be a good thing, just like ending mortality would be a good thing in the medical profession, but I think at the moment appears to be unlikely, although a worthy goal, right? So what does it look like? I don't know. I mean, honestly, I know that it looks like not being the most incarcerated country in the world. I know that it looks like going back to a more balanced level of incarceration as we had for many decades before everything got out of whack in the late 1970s and the 80s, not coincidentally. Shortly after the time when Richard Nixon decided that the best way to get at his political enemies, which he viewed as anti-war activists and blacks, was to claim that marijuana was a weed with roots in hell. A lot of this is very, very embroiled politically. So I think that would be a really good start. And then I get to retire. And then fortunately, people like you get to take us on the rest of the mission as culture changes and possibilities change and alternatives develop. We have some issues that other countries don't have. We are bathed in guns. We have more guns than people, and they last forever because they're mechanical devices. That's not actually true in Canada. And Canada's got a much lower murder rate. We have to deal with some problems in the United States, and that is only one of many, and you know what the other ones are. We have to deal with some problems in the United States that are different. And so I don't know exactly where it takes us, but this I know for sure. We need less incarceration. We need a prevention model. We need to put our resources into things that actually work, like public schools and job training and economic development, dealing with mental illness for what it is, dealing with addiction as the illness that it is, talking about drugs as the symptom, which is what they are, rather than the cause of crime. They are the symptom of mental illness. They are the symptom of trauma or maybe a biological disposition in some people. There's been this very interesting arc, if you look, for example, at the history of LGBTQ rights. There's been this very interesting arc where you went from saying that conduct is criminal to saying that is a disease to saying those are people. I just got back from Vancouver where they have supervised injection sites, and they've had them for 15 years, and nobody dies in these supervised injection sites ever, even though they have overdoses and they've had millions of injections. I'm in a city where they all want to Singapore me. Because I said supervised injection sites will save lives and we should do this kind of stuff. Well, we have to start looking at people who use drugs in the same way. It's criminal. And now that we have a lot of white people on opioids, now it's becoming a disease. But we still haven't gotten to the point where they're just people, you know? So I think those are the terms in which we need to think. And then all of you, when you have 10 or 15 years under your belts and I'm ready to retire and you're ready to take over, then all of you can figure out exactly where that finish line is so that I can seem out of date, and then when you get older, you can seem out of date, and the people who follow you can tell you you're out of date, but hopefully we'll all get to a much better place.
All right, so DA Krasner, I'm getting the... That was abrupt, but they were booting.